Montana Territory, 1875. The last rays of sunset painted the rolling prairie gold and crimson as Yancy Owens knelt beside the muddy creek, filling his canteen. At 25, he had the lean, weathered look of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle, though the lines around his eyes were still shallow. His Stetson cast a shadow across features too handsome for a man who rode the lonesome trails. 3 days of stubble couldn't hide the strong jawline or the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a memento from a bucking bronco that had nearly taken his eye 2 summers past. Yancy's buckskin gelding nickered softly, sensing his rider's unease. Something felt wrong about this stretch of land, too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. He'd been trailing a small herd of Mustangs, planning to break the best of them for the Triple R ranch where he worked as head wrangler. But now his instincts were screaming danger. "Easy chance," he murmured, rising slowly and scanning the tree line. "Something's not right." That's when he heard it, a woman's scream piercing the twilight, followed by harsh male laughter. Yancy's hand went instinctively to his Colt revolver as he swung into the saddle. He'd seen enough frontier violence to know that sound meant trouble, and trouble meant death out here where law was scarce as rain. "A man rides alone for a reason," he muttered to himself, repeating the creed he'd lived by since watching his parents' homestead burn 6 years ago. "Getting involved just gets you killed." Yet he was already urging chance toward the commotion, drawn by something stronger than his conviction that the frontier was no place for heroics. In a land where most folks looked away from others' troubles, Yancy had always been cursed with a conscience that wouldn't let him ride on. The source of the screams became clear as he crested a small rise. A stagecoach lay tilted on its side, one wheel shattered. 2 men in dusters were dragging a young woman from the wreckage, while a third held a gun on the driver, who lay wounded in the dirt. No passengers, just the girl and the driver. A male coach, most likely. The woman fought like a wildcat, her honey blonde hair coming loose from its pins as she struck out at her captors. Her pale blue traveling dress was torn at the shoulder, and even from this distance, Yancy could see the terror and defiance warring in her face. "Hand over the strong box and maybe we'll leave you the girl," one of the bandits was saying to the driver, who was clutching his bleeding leg. "There ain't nothing worth stealing," the driver gasped. "Just mail and such." "Liar," the outlaw kicked the wounded man. "We know what you're carrying." Yancy assessed the situation with the cool detachment of a man who'd faced down trouble before. 3 against 1, bad odds. The smart play was to ride on, maybe alert the law in Bitter Creek if he passed through. Not his business, not his fight. But the woman looked straight at him then, as if sensing his presence on the ridge. Even as one of the men grabbed her around the waist, her eyes locked with Yancy's across the distance. Something in those eyes, blue as a mountain lake and just as deep, reached inside him and took hold. Before he could reconsider, Yancy had drawn his rifle from its scabbard and fired a warning shot into the air. "That'll do, boys," he called out, his voice carrying across the open ground. "Let the lady go." The bandits whirled, the leader letting out a curse. "Mind your own business, cowboy, unless you're fixing to die today." Yancy's response was to level his Winchester and put a bullet in the dirt between the man's boots. "Next one's 2 feet higher, I won't tell you again." What followed was a blur of gunfire and motion. One outlaw went down with Yancy's bullet in his shoulder. Another fled into the gathering darkness. The leader, a scar-faced man with rotted teeth, managed to get a shot off that grazed Yancy's arm before taking a bullet to the leg that left him howling in the dust. When it was over, Yancy found himself standing over the wounded leader, the woman trembling but unharmed behind him. "Ought to finish you," Yancy told the outlaw coldly. "Save the hangman some rope." "Please don't," came a soft voice behind him. "There's been enough blood." Yancy turned to find himself looking down into those same blue eyes that had compelled him to intervene. Up close he could see she was younger than he'd thought, perhaps 20 at most. Her face was heart-shaped, framed by hair the color of ripe wheat fields, and despite the dirt and tear streaks on her cheeks, there was something refined about her that spoke of Eastern upbringing. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, suddenly aware of the blood seeping through his own sleeve. "I'm unharmed, thanks to you," her voice steadied. "But you're bleeding and Mr. Simmons needs help." She moved past Yancy to kneel beside the stage driver, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his wound with practiced hands. Yancy found himself impressed by her composure in the aftermath of such violence. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked as he used his bandana to bind his own wound. "Lydia Grayson," she answered without looking up from her task. "I'm traveling to Bitter Creek to take a position as the new schoolteacher." She glanced up then. "And you are?" "Yancy Owens. I wrangle for Triple R, about 20 miles east of Bitter Creek." "Then I'm doubly in your debt, Mr. Owens. You've saved both my life and my future employment." She managed a smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to breathtaking. "How can I ever repay you?" Yancy shifted uncomfortably, unused to gratitude. "No need for that. Couldn't just ride past." But as he helped secure the wounded outlaw and prepare to transport the injured driver to town, Yancy found himself wondering if he hadn't just complicated his carefully uncomplicated life. The way of the frontier was to mind your own business, trust no one, and never put down roots deep enough to hurt when they were torn up. He'd lived by those rules since watching outlaws destroy everything he'd ever loved. Yet as he helped Lydia Grayson onto his horse and began the slow journey toward Bitter Creek, leading the animal by the reins with the wounded stage driver slumped in the saddle behind her, Yancy couldn't help feeling that something fundamental had shifted in his world. And it troubled him more than any gunfight ever could. "Do you always rescue damsels in distress, Mr. Owens?" Lydia asked after they'd been walking for nearly an hour, the silence between them broken only by the driver's occasional groans. "First time, ma'am," Yancy replied truthfully, "and hopefully the last." She studied him in the moonlight. "You don't strike me as a man who makes a habit of involving himself in others' troubles." "I'm not," he said shortly. "The frontier's hard enough without taking on other folks' problems." "Then I'm even more grateful you made an exception today." She paused. "You could have been killed." Yancy didn't answer immediately, considering the truth of her words. He could have died today for a woman he'd never met. The thought should have reinforced his belief that entanglements were dangerous, yet strangely, he found himself unable to regret his decision. "Sometimes a man doesn't have a choice," he finally said. "There's always a choice, Mr. Owens," Lydia replied softly. "You chose to be brave when most would have ridden away." "That speaks to your character." Yancy felt uncomfortable under her assessment, just did what needed doing. They reached Bitter Creek near midnight, the small frontier town dark except for the saloon and the doctor's office, where a lamp still burned in the window. The town consisted of one main street lined with false-fronted buildings, general store, saloon, blacksmith, small hotel, and a few other businesses that served the surrounding ranches. By the time they delivered the driver to the doctor and explained the situation to the town marshal, who locked up the wounded outlaw with promises to send men for the other in the morning, Yancy was dead on his feet. The graze on his arm throbbed, and all he wanted was a bed for the night. "The hotel's just down the street," he told Lydia awkwardly, preparing to take his leave. "I expect the school board will have arrangements for you." Lydia looked suddenly lost, standing in the lamplight outside the marshal's office. "I was supposed to meet the chairman of the school board when the stage arrived. Now I'm not sure where to go at this hour." Yancy rubbed the back of his neck, conflicted. His instinct was to wish her well and be on his way. Getting involved any further would only complicate matters, yet he couldn't very well leave her standing in the street at midnight. "I'll see you to the hotel," he finally offered. "Make sure they have a room for you." The relief in her eyes made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being relied upon, hadn't let anyone depend on him since his family died. It created obligations, and obligations were dangerous on the frontier. As they walked the short distance to the hotel, Lydia suddenly stumbled, fatigue and delayed shock catching up with her. Without thinking, Yancy caught her elbow to steady her, feeling the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her sleeve. For a moment, they stood frozen, the contact between them seeming strangely intimate in the deserted street. "Thank you," she whispered, her face tilted up to his, close enough that he could see each individual eyelash. "For everything." Yancy stepped back, releasing her arm, just doing what any man would do. "No," she said with a certainty that surprised him. "Not any man, I've traveled enough to know that." At the hotel, the night clerk was roused, and arrangements were made for Lydia's accommodation. Yancy paid for her room despite her protests, telling himself it was only right since her luggage was still with the overturned stage. "Will I see you again?" she asked as they stood at the foot of the stairs. "Before you return to your ranch." "Probably not, ma'am," Yancy replied, tipping his hat. "I've business early, and then I'm heading back out to find those Mustangs I was tracking." Something like disappointment flickered across her face. "Then thank you again, Mr. Owens. I shall never forget what you did today." As Yancy made his way to the livery stable where he'd arranged to sleep in the hayloft, he told himself he'd done his duty and could now return to his solitary life with a clear conscience. The schoolteacher would be fine. Bitter Creek was a decent enough town, and her position would give her standing in the community. Yet as he settled into the hay, his arm throbbing, Yancy found himself remembering the way moonlight had gilded Lydia Grayson's hair, how steady her hands had been as she tended the stage driver's wounds, how her eyes had held both strength and vulnerability. "Don't be a fool," he muttered to himself. "The frontier's no place for getting sweet on a woman, especially not one who belongs in a schoolhouse, not on the back of a horse chasing wild mustangs." But sleep was a long time coming, and when it did, his dreams were filled with honey-blonde hair and eyes blue as mountain lakes. Yancy intended to leave Bitter Creek at first light, but his wounded arm had other ideas. By morning, the Grays was angry and inflamed, forcing him to seek out the town doctor. After a stern lecture about the dangers of infection and proper wound care, Yancy found himself with his arm in a sling and orders to rest for at least 2 days. "Damn waste of time," he grumbled as he crossed the street toward the general store, intending to stock up on supplies before his enforced idleness. That's when he saw her again. Lydia stood on the boardwalk outside the store, deep in conversation with a portly, bearded man Yancy recognized as Hiram Foster, who owned the town's largest mercantile and served as head of the school board. She wore a simple brown dress today, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet, looking every inch the proper schoolteacher. Yancy intended to pass by without interrupting, but Lydia glanced up and saw him. Her face brightened immediately. "Mr. Owens, what a pleasant surprise. I thought you'd be gone by now." Her eyes fell to his sling. "Oh, your arm, is it worse?" "Just a precaution, ma'am," he said, uncomfortable with her concern. "Doctor says I need to rest it for a couple days." "Then it's Providence," she declared. "Now I'll have the chance to properly thank you." She turned to her companion. "Mr. Foster, this is the gentleman I told you about. The one who rescued me from the stagecoach robbery." Foster pumped Yancy's good hand enthusiastically. "Young man, this town owes you a debt of gratitude. We've been waiting months for Miss Grayson to arrive and take over our school. The children have been running wild without proper education." Yancy extracted his hand from Foster's grip, just happened to be passing by. "Nevertheless," Foster continued, "you must join us for supper tonight. My wife insists on meeting Miss Grayson's rescuer, and we'd be honored to host you." Before Yancy could formulate a polite refusal, Lydia added, "Please say yes, Mr. Owens." "It would mean a great deal to me." Faced with those earnest blue eyes, Yancy found himself accepting the invitation against his better judgment. The rest of the day passed slowly. Yancy tended to chance, arranged for repairs to his tack, and tried not to think about the supper invitation he'd accepted. He wasn't suited for polite company, especially not in his trail-worn clothes with his rough frontier manners. But as evening approached, he found himself at the barber's getting a proper shave, and then purchasing a new shirt at the mercantile. "Fool errand," he muttered to his reflection as he straightened his bandana. "She's a schoolteacher with fancy Eastern ways, and you're a saddled tramp who talks more to horses than people." Yet at 7 o'clock sharp, Yancy found himself knocking on the door of the Foster residence, a substantial 2-story house at the edge of town. Mrs. Foster, a plump, pleasant woman with graying hair, welcomed him warmly and ushered him into a parlor where Lydia was already seated. She rose when he entered, and Yancy felt his breath catch. Gone was the trail-dusty, frightened woman from the stagecoach attack. In her place stood a vision in a simple but elegant green dress that brought out flecks of emerald in her blue eyes. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged in an artful style that framed her face, revealing a slender neck adorned with a modest cameo. "Mr. Owens," she said with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "How wonderful that you could join us." The evening progressed more smoothly than Yancy had feared. The Fosters were unpretentious people despite their prominence in Bitter Creek, and the conversation flowed easily, centered mostly on Lydia's journey west and her plans for the school. "I was teaching at a ladies' seminary in Boston," she explained as they ate Mrs. Foster's excellent roast beef. "But I always dreamed of coming west, where education is most desperately needed." "Mighty brave for a young lady to travel so far alone," Yancy observed. "I've been alone since my parents died of influenza 3 years ago," Lydia replied matter-of-factly. "I was 20 then, I'm 23 now. When you have no family ties, it's easier to follow your heart's calling." Yancy felt a surprising kinship with her at those words. He, too, had been left alone in the world, though in far more violent circumstances. "The West needs more women of courage," Mrs. Foster declared, "especially educated ones who can teach our children more than just their letters. They need to learn about beauty and art and literature, too." "I'm not certain how much use poetry is when you're mending fences or breaking horses," Yancy said without thinking. Instead of taking offense, Lydia laughed, a genuine musical sound that made something warm unfurl in Yancy's chest. "Perhaps not directly useful," she conceded, "but the human spirit needs nourishment as much as the body needs food and the hands need work. Don't you find that the beauty of these western landscapes fills your soul, Mr. Owens? That's poetry, too, in its way." Yancy thought of dawn breaking over the prairie, of wild horses running against a backdrop of distant mountains, of star-filled night skies that seemed close enough to touch. "Reckon there's something to that," he admitted. After supper, while the Fosters bustled about in the kitchen preparing coffee, Lydia and Yancy found themselves momentarily alone in the parlor. A sudden awkwardness fell between them. "I never properly thanked you," Lydia said softly. "Not just for saving my life, but for your kindness afterward, paying for my hotel room, making sure I was safe." Yancy shrugged his good shoulder. "Wasn't nothing. It was everything to me." She moved a step closer. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Owens?" He nodded cautiously. "Why did you intervene? You could have ridden past, many would have." "What made you stop?" Yancy considered the question, finding no easy answer. "I've seen too much wrong done when good folks looked away," he finally said. "Lost my family to men like those outlaws when I was 19. No one helped us then." Compassion filled her eyes. "I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago, 6 years that felt like a lifetime." "Not so very long," she said gently. "And some wounds never fully heal." Before he could respond, the Fosters returned with coffee and pie, and the moment passed. But Yancy found himself watching Lydia throughout the remainder of the evening, struck by her perceptiveness and the genuine warmth she showed not just to him, but to the Fosters as well. When it came time to leave, Hiram Foster insisted on walking partway with Yancy, explaining that he wanted to discuss something in private. "That young lady in there," Foster said once they were out of earshot of the house, "is a godsend to our community. Not just educated, but kind and determined, too." "Seems so," Yancy agreed, wondering where this was heading. "Thing is, the school's not quite ready yet. Needs another week of work, new desks arriving, some repairs to the roof. Mrs. Foster suggested Miss Grayson might benefit from seeing more of the territory before she's confined to the schoolhouse." Foster eyed Yancy speculatively. "I understand you're headed back to the Triple R tomorrow." Yancy suddenly saw where the conversation was going. "Mr. Foster, if you're suggesting what I think you are. The ranch is only 20 miles, you said so yourself." Mrs. Foster thought perhaps Miss Grayson might enjoy seeing a working cattle operation. Educational, you might say. "We'd send along our hired man as chaperone, of course, for propriety's sake." "I don't think—" "Just consider it," Foster urged. "The girl's never seen anything of the real West except for that terrible experience with the stagecoach. Wouldn't it be fitting if her first proper glimpse of frontier life came with the man who ensured she lived to see it?" Yancy wanted to refuse outright. Taking responsibility for the schoolteacher, even for a day's journey, went against everything he believed about keeping to himself. Yet a small part of him, a part he'd thought long buried, was intrigued by the idea of showing Lydia the beauty of the open range, of seeing her reaction to the wild places he loved. "I'll think on it," he finally said, which was more than he'd intended to concede. Foster beamed. "That's all I ask. Good night, Owens, and thank you again for what you did." As Yancy walked back to the livery stable where he'd taken a proper room for the night, he told himself he would politely decline in the morning. The smart play was to ride out alone, as he always did. Getting entangled with the new schoolteacher would only lead to complications, and complications got a man killed on the frontier. Yet when morning came, Yancy found himself agreeing to Foster's plan, telling himself it was only because the doctor had suggested he avoid riding alone with his injured arm for another day. By noon, he was helping Lydia onto a gentle mare borrowed from the livery, while Foster's hired man, a taciturn fellow named Jenkins, waited on his own horse nearby. "I can't believe I'm actually doing this," Lydia confessed, looking both excited and nervous in the simple riding skirt Mrs. Foster had lent her. "I've only ridden in city parks before, never across open country." "Daisy, they're as gentle as they come," Yancy assured her, adjusting her stirrups. "Just remember what I showed you, and you'll be fine." As they rode out of town, Lydia's initial nervousness gave way to delight as the vast landscape opened before them. The late summer prairie stretched to the horizon in waves of gold and green, dotted with wildflowers and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking hidden creeks and water holes. "It's magnificent," she breathed, her face alight with wonder. "So much bigger than I imagined, yet not empty at all. It's teeming with life." Yancy found himself pointing out things he normally took for granted: a hawk circling overhead, a distant herd of antelope, the different grasses that cattle preferred. Lydia absorbed it all with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that revealed both her intelligence and her Eastern perspective. "How do you not get lost out here?" she asked as they stopped to rest the horses near a small creek. "Everything looks the same to me." "Not when you know what to look for," Yancy explained, pointing to the distant mountains. "You keep track of the landmarks, those peaks there, the bend in this creek, that stand of trees. The land speaks if you learn to listen." Jenkins, their chaperone, kept a respectful distance, smoking his pipe and tending to the horses, while Yancy and Lydia sat on sun-warmed rocks beside the creek. "You love it out here, don't you?" Lydia observed, "despite the dangers and hardships." Yancy nodded. "Can't imagine being hemmed in by city walls. Out here a man can breathe." "Or a woman," she added with a smile. "I'm beginning to understand the appeal, though I admit the isolation would be difficult for me. I've always lived among people." "Gets easier with time," Yancy said. "You learn to keep your own company." Lydia studied him, her head tilted thoughtfully. "Is that what happened after you lost your family? You learned to be alone?" The personal question caught him off guard. Most folks knew better than to pry into a man's past out west. "Something like that," he answered tersely. Sensing his withdrawal, Lydia changed the subject, asking about the Mustangs he'd been tracking before their paths crossed. The moment of tension passed, but Yancy found himself unsettled by how easily this woman seemed to see through the barriers he'd carefully constructed around himself. They reached the Triple R by late afternoon. The ranch sprawled across a valley, the main house and bunkhouse flanked by corrals, a barn, and various outbuildings. Cattle grazed on the surrounding hillsides, and the sounds of ranch life, hammering from the blacksmith shop, the lowing of calves, the shouts of cowboys, filled the air. Rosalie Reeves, the owner's wife, came out to greet them, her weathered face breaking into a smile when Yancy explained who Lydia was and why they'd come. "A schoolteacher, my stars, we don't get many educated ladies out this way. You must stay for supper and tell me all about the fashions back east. I haven't been to a proper city in 15 years. While Rosalie whisked Lydia away to show her the main house, Jenkins took his leave, explaining he needed to return to town that evening. Yancy found himself at loose ends until Caleb Reeves, the ranch owner, spotted him from the corral. "Owens, thought you were chasing those Mustangs," the older man called out, striding over with a hand outstretched. "Got delayed," Yancy explained, briefly recounting the stagecoach incident while downplaying his own role. Reeves whistled. "Lucky for the lady you came along. Those hill outlaws don't leave witnesses." He eyed Yancy's sling. "You fit to ride tomorrow. That bay stallion's been leading the herd north toward Miller's Canyon. If we don't catch him soon, we'll lose him to the high country until spring." "Arm's nearly healed," Yancy assured him. "I'll head out at first light." That evening, Yancy found himself seated at the Reeves' dining table beside Lydia, who was charming both Caleb and Rosalie with tales of her journey west. Cleaned up from the trail and glowing with enthusiasm, she looked completely at home despite the rustic surroundings. "Miss Grayson was just telling us how you saved her from those outlaws," Rosalie said, giving Yancy a knowing look that made him uncomfortable. Quite the heroic tale. Wasn't heroic, Yancy muttered, just happened to be there. Mr. Owens is too modest, Lydia insisted. He faced 3 armed men alone with no thought for his own safety. Sounds like Owens, Caleb agreed with a nod. Best wrangler I've got, but too reckless by half when there's trouble. After supper, while Rosalie showed Lydia to the guest room, Caleb pulled Yancy aside. That's a fine young woman, he observed. Smart as a whip and pretty as a picture, too. She's Bitter Creek's new schoolteacher, Yancy said flatly, hoping to forestall whatever Caleb was insinuating. Caleb studied him. Well, Bitter Creek's only 20 miles away, not so far for a man with a good horse. I'm not looking for entanglements, Yancy said firmly. Caleb clapped him on the shoulder. Nobody ever is, son. That's how life surprises you, he changed the subject. Now about those Mustangs. Later that night, Yancy stood on the porch, smoking and looking up at stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. He'd be gone before dawn, tracking the Mustang herd, doing what he did best, working alone in wild country, answerable to no one, responsible only for himself. It's breathtaking, isn't it? He turned to find Lydia beside him, wrapped in a shawl against the night chill. In the moonlight, her hair gleamed silver gold and her eyes reflected starlight. Don't get views like this in Boston, he agreed. No, she said softly. Everything's different out here, bigger. More immediate somehow. They stood in companionable silence for a moment before Lydia spoke again. Mrs. Reeves tells me you're leaving at dawn to track those wild horses. That's the plan. Then I suppose this is goodbye, she turned to face him. I want to thank you, Mr. Owens, not just for saving my life, but for showing me the beauty of this place. I understand now why people are willing to endure such hardships to make their homes here. You'll do fine in Bitter Creek, Yancy said, surprised to find he meant it. Folks there are good people. I know, she hesitated. Perhaps if your work brings you to town, you might visit the school someday. I'd like the children to meet a real cowboy, especially one who knows so much about the land and its creatures. Yancy should have made a non-committal response, the kind that closed doors rather than leaving them ajar. Instead, he found himself saying, I might do that, Miss Grayson. She smiled then, a smile that reached her eyes and did something peculiar to Yancy's usually steady heartbeat. I'd like that very much. And please call me Lydia. Lydia, he repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate on his tongue. Then you should call me Yancy. Yancy, she echoed softly. Good night, then. And good luck with your wild horses. After she'd gone inside, Yancy remained on the porch far longer than he'd intended, his thoughts more tangled than they'd been in years. When he finally sought his bunk in the ranch hand's quarters, sleep proved elusive. Dawn found him riding away from the Triple R, following the trail of the Mustang herd. He didn't look back toward the main house, where Lydia would be preparing to return to Bitter Creek with one of the ranch hands Caleb had assigned to escort her. There was no point in looking back. Their paths had crossed briefly, dramatically, and now they would diverge again. That was the way of the frontier. Yet as the miles stretched behind him, Yancy couldn't shake the memory of starlight in Lydia's eyes or the way his name had sounded when she said it. For the first time since losing his family, he felt the dangerous stirring of connection, of wanting something more than the solitary existence he'd built for himself. Fool notion, he told Chance as they climbed a rocky slope, following faint tracks. She's made for town life and teaching children. You're made for the trail and sleeping under the stars. The gelding flicked an ear back but offered no opinion on the matter. For the next 2 weeks, Yancy lost himself in the work he loved best. He tracked the Mustang herd into the high country, eventually capturing the bay stallion and 4 of the best mares. The work was exhausting and dangerous, requiring all his skill and focus. It left no time for thoughts of blue eyes or honey-blonde hair, at least during daylight hours. At night, though, as he sat beside his small campfire, Yancy found his mind wandering back to Lydia Grayson. He wondered how she was settling into her new life in Bitter Creek, if the children were responding to her teaching, if she missed the refinements of Eastern life. More than once, he caught himself planning what he might say if he did happen to ride into town, how he might casually stop by the schoolhouse. This has got to stop, he told himself sternly as he led the captured Mustangs back toward the Triple R, No good comes from getting sweet on a woman like that. Different worlds entirely. He arrived back at the ranch to find it buzzing with unusual activity. Cowboys were cleaning up, putting on their best shirts, and the smell of roasting meat and baking pies filled the air. "What's the occasion?" Yancy asked Jake, one of the younger hands, as he turned the Mustangs into a corral. "Harvest dance in town tonight," Jake replied with a grin. "Whole ranch is going. Boss says even you're invited, though nobody expects you'll come. You never do." Yancy had indeed avoided such social gatherings in the past. They inevitably involved matchmaking attempts by well-meaning ranch wives or awkward conversations with people who couldn't understand his preference for solitude. "Not my kind of entertainment," he agreed, already planning a quiet evening alone while the others were gone. But as he reported to Caleb about the captured Mustangs, the ranch owner had other ideas. "Fine work, Owens," Caleb said, examining the bay stallion with appreciation. "Worth every penny of the bonus I'm paying you. Now go get cleaned up. Wagon leaves for town in an hour." "I wasn't planning to attend the dance, sir." Caleb fixed him with a stern look. "Wasn't asking, Owens. Whole ranch is going ranch policy. Besides," he added with a sly smile, "heard the new schoolteacher organized the whole thing. Fundraiser for school supplies or some such. Would be downright rude not to show support for education." Yancy opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. Arguing with Caleb Reeves was like trying to divert a flash flood with a shovel, pointless and potentially dangerous. "Yes, sir," he conceded grudgingly. An hour later, Yancy found himself wedged into a wagon with 5 other cowboys, all freshly shaved and wearing their Sunday best, heading toward Bitter Creek. He'd done what he could with his own appearance, donning his least-worn shirt and the vest he saved for special occasions. His dark hair was still damp from washing, and his face felt oddly naked after shaving off 2 weeks' worth of beard. The harvest dance was being held in the town's largest barn, cleared of its usual contents and decorated with autumn leaves, corn shocks, and paper lanterns. By the time the Triple R contingent arrived, the celebration was in full swing. A fiddle and banjo played lively tunes while couples twirled across the swept dirt floor, and tables along one wall groaned under the weight of food brought by every family in the area. Yancy hung back near the entrance, feeling out of place despite the casual nature of the gathering. His eyes scanned the crowd automatically, and then he saw her. Lydia stood near the refreshment table, laughing at something Hiram Foster had said. She wore a dress of russet brown that complemented her coloring, simpler than the fashions the other women wore, but somehow more elegant. Her hair was arranged in a coronet of braids with a few tendrils escaping to frame her face. She looked happy, confident, and completely at home among the townsfolk. As if sensing his gaze, she glanced toward the entrance. Her eyes widened in recognition, and a smile bloomed across her face that made Yancy's chest tighten. Before he could decide whether to approach her or retreat, she was making her way through the crowd toward him. "Yancy," she exclaimed, using his given name without hesitation. "You came. I'd heard you were still out tracking those Mustangs." "Got back today," he said, suddenly acutely aware of every person watching their interaction. In a town the size of Bitter Creek, the new schoolteacher talking to a solitary cowboy was bound to start tongues wagging. If Lydia noticed the attention, she gave no sign. "Did you catch your wild stallion?" "And 4 mares," he confirmed, surprised and pleased by her remembering the details of his work. "How are you settling in? School going well?" "Wonderfully," she said with genuine enthusiasm. "The children are eager to learn and the community has been so welcoming. I'm organizing a Christmas pageant next and," she broke off with a laugh. "Listen to me chattering on. Would you like some punch? The music is lovely, isn't it?" Before Yancy quite knew how it happened, he found himself with a cup of punch in his hand, standing with Lydia at the edge of the dance floor while she pointed out various townsfolk and shared little stories about them. There was none of the awkwardness he'd expected, none of the strained conversation he usually endured at such gatherings. Lydia seemed genuinely interested in his opinions and experiences, and he found himself responding in kind. "Dance with me?" she asked as the musicians struck up a slower tune. Yancy stiffened. "I don't dance much." "Neither do I out here," she admitted, "but I think we could manage together. Unless your arm is still troubling you." It wasn't, but Yancy almost wished it were. Dancing meant holding Lydia close, being the focus of even more attention from the curious townsfolk. Yet when she looked at him expectantly, he found himself setting down his punch cup and offering his hand. "Can't promise not to step on your toes." Her smile was worth whatever gossip might follow. "I'll risk it." As Yancy led Lydia onto the dance floor, he was acutely conscious of the speculative glances from those around them. The schoolteacher and the solitary cowboy, an unlikely pair if ever there was one. He tried to focus on remembering the steps to the simple waltz, but it was difficult with Lydia so close, the scent of lavender water surrounding her, her hand small but firm in his. "Everyone is watching us," she murmured, though she didn't seem distressed by the fact. "Not used to being the center of attention," Yancy admitted. "Nor I," she said, "though I suppose as the new teacher I'm still something of a novelty." "It's more than that," Yancy said before he could think better of it. "You're different from most women out here, more educated, more—" He searched for the right word. "Eastern," she supplied with a slight smile. "I was going to say refined, but yes, that too." She laughed softly. "Yet here I am, dancing in a barn in Montana territory with a cowboy who captures wild horses. My seminary classmates would be scandalized." Her easy humor relaxed him, and Yancy found himself smiling, a rare enough occurrence that he saw several onlookers do double takes. "Are you glad you came west?" he asked as they turned in time to the music, despite the rough start with the stagecoach. Lydia considered the question thoughtfully. "Yes," she finally said. "It hasn't been what I expected. It's been both harder and more wonderful. The people here have such resilience, such spirit, and the land." She glanced toward the open barn doors where stars were visible in the night sky. "It gets under your skin, doesn't it? All that space and freedom." "That it does," Yancy agreed, surprised by her perception. Most Easterners he'd met either romanticized the West or complained about its hardships. Few understood the complex pull of the frontier the way Lydia seemed to. The dance ended too soon. As Yancy reluctantly released Lydia, Hiram Foster appeared at their side. "Miss Grayson, the children want to show you their harvest display before the judging," the merchant said, nodding politely to Yancy. "Good to see you, Owens. Didn't expect you at our little gathering." "Mr. Reeves insisted," Yancy explained. "Well, I'm glad he did," Lydia said warmly. "Will you excuse me for a moment, Yancy? I promised the children I'd look at their work." As she walked away with Foster, Yancy found himself the target of curious stares and whispered comments. Uncomfortable with the attention, he retreated to a quiet corner near the barn doors, where the cool night air provided relief from the crowded interior. He was considering slipping away entirely when Rosalie Reeves found him. "Don't even think about it, Owens," she said with the directness of a woman who ran a household of cowboys. "I saw you dancing with Miss Grayson. You leave now and you'll hurt that girl's feelings." "She's busy with her students," Yancy protested. "Probably won't even notice I'm gone." Rosalie snorted. "For a man who can track a Mustang over bare rock, you're mighty blind about some things. That young lady lit up like a Christmas tree when she saw you walk in." Yancy shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Reeves, with all due respect, you're seeing things that aren't there. Miss Grayson is just being friendly." "It's her nature." "Is that so?" Rosalie raised an eyebrow. "Then why has she turned down 3 invitations to dance since you left the floor, including one from Dr. Wilson's son, who's considered quite a catch in these parts?" Before Yancy could formulate a response, Lydia herself reappeared, her face flushed with pleasure. "The children have made the most wonderful harvest centerpiece," she told them. "You must come see it, both of you." Rosalie gave Yancy a meaningful look before excusing herself to find her husband, leaving the two of them alone again. "I thought you might have left," Lydia admitted. "You looked uncomfortable on the dance floor." "Not used to being watched," Yancy said simply. "No, I suppose not." She studied him with those perceptive blue eyes. "You prefer the open country where a man can go days without seeing another soul." It wasn't a question, but Yancy nodded anyway. "Most times." "Only most times?" Her voice held a hint of something Yancy couldn't quite identify, hope, perhaps, or curiosity. Before he could respond, they were interrupted by the announcement that supper was being served. The moment, whatever it had been, passed. Yet throughout the meal and the festivities that followed, Yancy found himself repeatedly in Lydia's company, as if some invisible thread kept drawing them together despite the crowds and competing demands for her attention. It was late when the Triple R wagon prepared to leave. Yancy, who had surprised himself by actually enjoying much of the evening, found Lydia to say goodbye. "Will you come to town again soon?" she asked, standing with him just outside the barn while the last of the dance continued inside. "The school board approved my proposal for guest speakers to talk to the children about different aspects of frontier life. I thought perhaps you might tell them about horses or tracking, or—" she trailed off, suddenly seeming uncertain. "I'd be happy to," Yancy found himself saying, though public speaking was even lower on his list of preferred activities than dancing. "Next time I'm in town." "When might that be?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "I'll be bringing those Mustangs in for breaking next week," he said after a moment's consideration. "Could stop by the school afterward." Her face brightened. Wednesday afternoon would be perfect. "The children have nature studies then." "Wednesday," he agreed, tipping his hat. "Miss Grayson." "Lydia," she reminded him softly. "After sharing a dance, I think we can dispense with formalities, don't you?" "Lydia," he corrected himself, liking the way her name felt on his tongue. As the wagon rolled away from Bitter Creek, Jake nudged Yancy with an elbow. "Schoolteacher seems sweet on you, Owens. Half the men in town were trying to get her attention, but she kept coming back to you." "She's just grateful," Yancy said firmly. "I helped her out of a tight spot when she first arrived." Jake said skeptically. "And I'm the King of England, you asking her to the Thanksgiving social next month." "Hadn't planned on it," Yancy replied, though the idea took root in his mind despite his determination to remain unattached. "Better move quick then," Jake advised. "Word is, the banker's son is working up the nerve to court her proper-like with flowers and everything." Yancy told himself he had no right to the jolt of jealousy that shot through him at Jake's words. Lydia Grayson was free to receive attention from any man she chose. Their paths had crossed by chance, nothing more. Yet as the wagon rumbled through the night, carrying him away from Bitter Creek and the woman who had somehow begun to occupy his thoughts, Yancy found himself calculating how many days until Wednesday. True to his word, Yancy arrived at the Bitter Creek schoolhouse the following Wednesday afternoon. The simple clapboard building sat on the edge of town, its white paint fresh and a small bell tower rising from the roof. As he tethered Chance to the hitching post, Yancy felt unaccountably nervous. He'd faced down rustlers and wild stallions with less trepidation than he now felt at the prospect of speaking to a room full of children. The sound of young voices reciting in unison reached him as he approached the door. Taking a deep breath, Yancy knocked, then removed his hat as footsteps approached from inside. Lydia opened the door, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at the sight of him. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair neatly pinned back in a practical style befitting her profession. "Yancy, you came," she said warmly. "The children are so excited to meet a real wrangler." Before he could respond, a chorus of young voices called out, "Good afternoon, Mr. Owens." Yancy turned to see 20 or so children of various ages seated at desks, watching him with undisguised curiosity. "Class, this is Mr. Yancy Owens," Lydia announced. "He works at the Triple R Ranch, where he specializes in tracking and capturing wild horses. He's going to tell us about his work and answer your questions about frontier life." What followed was one of the most surprising hours of Yancy's life. Far from being bored by his halting explanations of horse behavior and tracking techniques, the children were fascinated. They asked intelligent questions, exclaimed over the Mustang sketches he somewhat self-consciously shared from his pocket notebook, and hung on his every word about survival in the wilderness. Lydia watched from her desk, occasionally guiding the discussion, but mostly allowing the natural exchange to unfold. Yancy found himself relaxing under her encouraging smile, his initial awkwardness giving way to genuine enthusiasm as he shared knowledge he'd never articulated before. "Mr. Owens, is it true you saved Miss Grayson from outlaws?" one bold boy asked toward the end of the session. Yancy glanced at Lydia, who looked momentarily flustered. "I happened to be passing by when Miss Grayson's stagecoach was having trouble," he said carefully. "Just lent a hand, that's all." "Pa says you shot 2 men dead," another child piped up. "Your pa is mistaken," Yancy corrected gently. "No one died that day, thankfully. And the real hero was your teacher, who kept her wits about her in a frightening situation." Lydia looked grateful for his diplomatic handling of the question. I think that's enough excitement for one afternoon, she said, rising from her desk. Please thank Mr. Owens for sharing his time and knowledge with us. A chorus of thank yous rang out, and then the children were gathering their slates and books as Lydia dismissed them for the day. Some lingered to ask Yancy one more question, or simply to stare at his spurs and well-worn boots before racing off to their homes. When the last child had departed, Lydia closed the schoolhouse door and turned to Yancy with a smile that made his heart skip. "Thank you," she said simply. "You were wonderful with them." Yancy shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. "They're good kids, smart." "They are," she agreed, moving to straighten papers on her desk. "And they'll be talking about this for weeks. A real cowboy in their classroom, it's more exciting than Christmas for some of them." Yancy watched her move about the room, putting things in order with practiced efficiency. There was something deeply appealing about the way she commanded her domain, this Eastern woman who had transplanted herself to the frontier and seemed to be thriving. "Would you like to take a walk?" Lydia asked suddenly, looking up from her task. "The afternoon is lovely, and I've been inside all day." The invitation took Yancy by surprise, but he found himself nodding. "I'd like that." They strolled through town and beyond, following a path that led to a small creek lined with cottonwoods turning golden with autumn. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the air held the crispness of approaching winter. Lydia walked close beside Yancy, her shorter strides matching his deliberately slowed pace. "You're good with children," she observed after they'd walked in comfortable silence for a while. "Have you ever thought of having your own someday?" The question caught Yancy off guard. "Can't say that I have," he admitted. "My life doesn't leave much room for family." "Because you choose to keep it that way." Her directness was disarming. Yancy considered the question seriously. "Partly choice, partly circumstance. The frontier's a hard place to raise children, seen too many widows and orphans." "Yet families do manage," Lydia pointed out gently. "The Reeves have 3 grown children, I'm told. And many of my students come from large, happy families despite the hardships." "Some folks make it work," Yancy conceded. He hesitated, then asked, "What about you? Did you come west looking for a husband?" Lydia laughed, the sound bright in the quiet afternoon. "Not specifically, no. I came to teach, though I won't pretend I haven't considered marriage someday." She glanced at him sidelong. The right partner could make frontier life less daunting. Something in her tone made Yancy's pulse quicken. They had stopped walking, standing beneath a cottonwood whose leaves whispered overhead. Lydia's face was titled up toward his, her expression open and unguarded. "Lydia," Yancy began, not entirely sure what he was going to say, only knowing that something important hung in the balance. Before he could continue, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the moment. They both turned to see a rider approaching at a gallop. As the horse drew nearer, Yancy recognized Jake from the Triple R, his face grim. "Owens," Jake called out, reining in his lathered mount. "Been looking all over for you. Boss sent me to fetch you back to the ranch right away." "What's happened?" Yancy demanded, instantly alert. "Those outlaws from the stagecoach robbery, the ones that got away, they hit the Watson place last night, burned the barn, stole horses. Mrs. Watson recognized one of them as the Scarface you wounded." Jake glanced apologetically at Lydia. "Pardon the talk of violence, ma'am." "It's all right," Lydia said, though her face had gone pale. "Are the Watsons hurt?" "Shaken up but alive," Jake assured her. "Thing is, the outlaws were asking questions about you, Miss Grayson, and about Owens here. Marshall thinks they're looking for revenge." A cold knot formed in Yancy's stomach. This was exactly why he avoided entanglements. They created vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities got people killed. "I need to get back to the ranch," he told Lydia, already calculating the fastest route and what preparations would be needed. "Of course," she said, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "Should I be concerned?" "Here in town." Jake answered before Yancy could. "Marshall's organizing extra patrols, ma'am. Town should be safe enough, but you might want to stay with friends for a few days just to be cautious." "I'll speak with the Fosters," she said, her practical nature asserting itself despite the shock. "They've offered me a room in their home before." Yancy wanted to say more to offer personal protection, but the urgency of the situation pressed on him. "I'll come back as soon as I can," he promised. "Stay in town, stay with people." Lydia nodded, her blue eyes wide but steady. Be careful, Yancy." The genuine concern in her voice stayed with him as he and Jake rode hard for the Triple R. Once again, violence had intruded just as Yancy had begun to lower his defenses, to consider possibilities beyond his solitary existence. It seemed the frontier was determined to remind him why he'd chosen isolation in the first place. At the ranch, Caleb Reeves had already organized a posse. The outlaws had been tracked heading northeast, toward the Badlands where the territory's worst elements often sought refuge. The marshal had deputized several men, including Yancy, whose tracking skills would be essential in the rough country ahead. "We ride at dawn," Caleb informed the assembled men. "These vermin have terrorized honest folks long enough. Time to end it." That night, as Yancy checked his weapons and packed provisions for the hunt, his thoughts kept returning to Lydia. The outlaws had asked about her specifically, which meant she was in danger because of her connection to him. If anything happened to her because he'd intervened in that stagecoach robbery. "You look like a man wrestling with demons," Caleb observed, finding Yancy alone in the tack room. "Thinking about the schoolteacher." Yancy didn't bother denying it. "This is why I keep to myself," he said grimly. "People around me end up targeted." Caleb leaned against the doorframe, studying the younger man. "That's frontier thinking from a bygone era, son. We're building communities now, not just surviving day to day. Can't do that if everyone's afraid to care about anyone else." "Tell that to the outlaws," Yancy said bitterly. "I intend to," Caleb replied, patting the rifle at his side. "But after we deal with this immediate threat, you might want to reconsider your philosophy. That young lady in town sees something in you worth knowing, despite the risks." "That's rare." Yancy had no answer for that. As the older man left him to his preparations, he found himself torn between the instinct to push Lydia away for her own safety and the growing desire to protect her, to be worthy of the trust she'd placed in him. Dawn came cold and clear. The posse rode out as the first light crested the eastern hills, 12 men intent on bringing frontier justice to those who'd violated the unwritten code of the West, that women and children were to be left unharmed, and honest homesteaders were to be respected. For 3 days, they tracked the outlaws through increasingly rough country. Yancy's skill proved invaluable as they followed signs most men would have missed: a displaced stone here, broken twigs there, the particular way grass bent under a horse's weight. The trail led them into a maze of ravines and box canyons, terrain that favored those who knew it well. On the 4th day, they caught up with their quarry. The outlaws had made camp in a sheltered canyon, clearly believing they'd lost their pursuers. The ensuing firefight was brief but violent. When it was over, 2 of the outlaws lay dead, another wounded, and Scarface himself was in custody, his shooting arm shattered by Caleb's rifle. "You're the one," Scarface spat when he saw Yancy approaching. "The one who shot me over that stuck-up schoolteacher." Yancy regarded him coldly. "And now you'll hang for murder and robbery." "Maybe," the outlaw sneered. "But my boys in Bitter Creek will have settled scores by now. Told them if we didn't return in a week, to burn the town and take the girl." Ice filled Yancy's veins. "You're lying." "Am I?" Scarface laughed through bloodied teeth. "Guess you'll find out when you get back, if there's anything left to go back to." It took every ounce of Yancy's self-control not to put a bullet in the man where he sat. Only the marshal's hand on his arm stayed his weapon. "He's baiting you, Owens," the lawman said quietly, "trying to split us up so his friends can ambush stragglers." "And if he's telling the truth," Yancy demanded, "if Bitter Creek is in danger?" The marshal considered this. "Take 2 men and ride ahead," he finally decided. "We'll follow with the prisoners, but be careful, could be a trap." Yancy chose Jake and another cowboy named Harris, both good men in a fight. They rode hard, pushing their horses to the limit of endurance, taking the most direct route back toward Bitter Creek. Yancy's mind raced with scenarios, each worse than the last. Had Lydia stayed with the Fosters as planned? Was the town on alert, or had they relaxed their vigilance as days passed without incident? They reached the outskirts of Bitter Creek at dusk 2 days later. From a distance, the town appeared peaceful, no smoke, no signs of attack. Relief warred with suspicion in Yancy's mind. Had Scarface been bluffing after all? "Looks quiet," Jake observed as they reined in on a ridge overlooking the settlement. "Too quiet," Harris added. "Where are the evening riders? Usually at least a few folks coming or going at this hour." Yancy had noticed the same thing. The town's main street should have shown activity, shopkeepers closing up, ranch hands heading to the saloon, families returning from visits. Instead, an unnatural stillness hung over Bitter Creek. "Something's wrong," he said grimly. "We approach carefully. Jake, circle around to the livery stable, see what horses are there. Harris, check the south end of town. I'll take the main street. Meet at the marshal's office in 30 minutes. Any sign of trouble, fire a warning shot." The men nodded and split off as planned. Yancy guided Chance down the slope at a walk, all senses alert for danger. As he reached the first buildings at the edge of town, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. The silence was oppressive, no children playing, no women calling them in for supper, no piano from the saloon. He passed the general store, noting its closed shutters despite the hour being well before normal closing time. The hotel likewise showed no signs of life, its usually bustling porch empty. Yancy's hand hovered near his holster as he continued down the street. The schoolhouse came into view, and Yancy's heart leaped into his throat. The door hung open, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. With growing dread, he dismounted and approached cautiously, drawing his revolver. "Lydia," he called softly, stepping into the shadowed interior. "Anyone here?" The classroom was empty but showed signs of hasty departure. Books left open, a chair overturned, a slate shattered on the floor. Yancy's pulse pounded in his ears as he examined the room for clues, for blood, for any indication of what had happened. A scrap of paper on Lydia's desk caught his eye. Moving closer, he saw it was a note, hastily scrawled. "Everyone at church, strangers in town. Marshal says stay together." Relief flooded through Yancy, followed immediately by renewed urgency. The church stood at the far end of town, past the marshal's office where he was supposed to meet Jake and Harris. If the townspeople had gathered there for safety, that's where any confrontation would be centered. As if confirming his fears, the crack of a gunshot echoed from the direction of the church, followed by shouting. Yancy ran for Chance, swung into the saddle, and galloped toward the sound, all caution abandoned in his desperate need to reach Lydia and the others. The scene that greeted him was chaotic. 4 rough-looking men had positioned themselves around the small white church, guns drawn. The marshal lay wounded on the church steps, while the townsfolk were presumably barricaded inside. Jake and Harris had arrived before Yancy and were exchanging fire with the outlaws from behind the cover of a nearby water trough and hitching post. Yancy took in the situation in an instant. The outlaws were attempting to force their way into the church but were pinned down by Jake and Harris's covering fire. It was a stalemate that couldn't last. Eventually, the outlaws would either break in or set fire to the building. Without hesitation, Yancy circled wide, using the gathering darkness and nearby buildings as cover. He dismounted behind the blacksmith shop, then worked his way toward the rear of the church. One of the outlaws had stationed himself at the back door, gun trained on the entrance in case anyone tried to escape. Yancy crept forward, silent as a mountain lion, until he was close enough to strike. In one fluid motion, he lunged, bringing the butt of his revolver down hard on the man's skull. The outlaw crumpled without a sound. The back door of the church opened a crack, and Hiram Foster's anxious face appeared. His eyes widened at the sight of Yancy standing over the unconscious outlaw. "Owens, thank God," the merchant whispered. "They've been here since noon, saying they'd burn us out if we didn't hand over you and Miss Grayson."
"Is she safe?"
"Is anyone hurt?" Yancy demanded. "She's fine, we're all inside. Pastor Williams took a graze to the arm, and of course the marshals shot worse out front." "Get everyone away from the windows," Yancy instructed. "I'm going to work my way around and take the others from behind." Foster nodded and closed the door quietly. Yancy dragged the unconscious outlaw into the shadow of a rain barrel, bound his hands with his own belt, and gagged him with a bandana. Then, keeping to cover, he began working his way toward the front of the church. The gunfight at the front continued sporadically. Yancy could hear Jake calling to the outlaws, trying to draw their fire while conserving his own ammunition. The strategy gave Yancy the chance he needed to get into position behind a stack of lumber intended for church repairs. From this vantage point, he could see 2 of the remaining outlaws crouched behind an overturned wagon. The third was using the corner of the church itself as cover, occasionally firing toward Jake and Harris's position. Yancy took careful aim at the nearest outlaw and squeezed the trigger. The man fell with a cry, clutching his shoulder. Before his companion could react, Yancy had fired again, the bullet striking the second man's leg. Only the third outlaw, the one using the church corner for cover, remained uninjured. "It's over," Yancy called out. "Throw down your weapons." Instead of surrendering, the last outlaw darted around the corner of the church and kicked open the front door. Before Jake or Harris could get a clear shot, the man had disappeared inside. Cold fear gripped Yancy's heart as screams erupted from within the church. Without conscious thought, he was running, vaulting over the lumber pile and racing for the entrance. Jake provided covering fire as Yancy charged up the steps, past the wounded marshal who was trying to drag himself to safety. Inside, chaos reigned. The congregation had pressed themselves against the far walls, women clutching children, men positioning themselves protectively in front. In the center aisle stood the outlaw, his gun trained on Lydia, who he held before him as a shield. "Drop your gun, cowboy," the man snarled, pressing his revolver to Lydia's temple. "Or the schoolteacher dies right here." Time seemed to slow. Yancy assessed the situation with the clarity that came in moments of extreme danger. The outlaw's hand was shaking. He was wounded after all, a graze along his side darkening his shirt with blood. Lydia's eyes met Yancy's, wide with fear but also with a determination that surprised him. She gave the slightest nod, a message passing between them without words. "Let her go," Yancy said calmly, his gun still raised. "It's me you want." "Drop the gun first," the outlaw insisted, tightening his grip on Lydia. "All right," Yancy agreed, slowly lowering his revolver. "Just don't hurt her." As his gun hand descended, Lydia suddenly moved. With a strength born of desperation, she drove her elbow hard into her captor's wounded side. The man howled in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to twist away. As she dropped to the floor, Yancy's gun came back up in a blur of motion. His shot echoed deafeningly in the confined space of the church. The outlaw staggered, a look of surprise on his face, then collapsed. Silence fell, broken only by the soft weeping of children and the ragged breathing of the frightened townsfolk. Yancy holstered his weapon and crossed to where Lydia knelt on the church floor. "Are you hurt?" he asked, gently helping her to her feet, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "No," she whispered, then with more strength, "No, I'm all right." Without thinking, Yancy pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him, as if to reassure himself of her safety. Lydia clung to him just as fiercely, her body trembling with delayed shock. "I knew you'd come," she murmured against his chest. "I knew you wouldn't abandon us." The simple faith in her words shook Yancy to his core. She had trusted him, not just with her life in that moment of danger, but with her belief that he would return for her. In a lifetime of keeping others at a distance, he had never experienced such unshakable confidence in his character. The aftermath of the confrontation was a blur of activity. The marshal, despite his wounds, took charge of securing the prisoners. Dr. Wilson tended to the injured, including the outlaws who had survived. The townspeople emerged from the church, shaken but relieved, many pausing to clap Yancy on the shoulder or murmur words of gratitude. Through it all, Lydia remained at Yancy's side, as if unwilling to let him out of her sight again. When the immediate crisis had passed and they finally had a moment alone on the church steps, she turned to face him, her expression serious. "When they came to the school, asking for you and me by name, I was terrified," she admitted. "Not just for myself, but for you, out there hunting the others, not knowing there was danger waiting here." Yancy's jaw tightened at the memory of his fear when he'd found the schoolhouse empty. "I should never have left town. Should have known they'd send men here." "You couldn't have known," Lydia said, placing a hand on his arm. "And if you hadn't gone with the posse, the ringleader might never have been captured." Yancy covered her hand with his own, marveling at its delicate strength. "When I saw that open door, thought you might be," he couldn't finish the sentence, the possibility still too raw. "But I wasn't," she reminded him gently. "Thanks to you, none of us were harmed." They stood in silence for a moment, the night settling around them, stars emerging in the darkening sky. The town was gradually returning to normal, lights appearing in windows, people returning to their homes now that the danger had passed. "Lydia," Yancy said finally, his voice low and earnest, "what happened today, it's the reason I've always kept to myself. People I care about become targets." She met his gaze steadily. "Is that why you've avoided connections, because you're afraid of bringing danger to others?" "Partly," he acknowledged. "Saw my family killed because my father stood up to outlaws." Swore I'd never put anyone else at risk that way. And yet you risked yourself for me twice now, she pointed out. You can't protect people by staying away from them, Yancy. That only ensures they face dangers alone. Her words struck him with the force of revelation. For 6 years, he'd believed isolation was the answer, that by avoiding attachments, he was keeping others safe. But today had proven the opposite. His connection to Lydia had drawn danger, yes, but it had also ensured he was there when that danger arrived. I don't know if I can change who I've become, he said honestly. Been alone a long time. Lydia's smile was gentle but determined. You don't have to change overnight. Just consider that there might be another way to live, even on the frontier. Before Yancy could respond, Jake approached, looking apologetic for the interruption. Marshall says the rest of the posse should arrive with Scarface tomorrow, he reported. Wants to know if we're staying in town tonight or heading back to the Triple R. The question hung in the air, suddenly weighted with significance beyond the practical matter of accommodations. Yancy looked at Lydia, reading the invitation in her eyes. I'm staying, he told Jake. Got some things to sort out here. Jake nodded, a knowing smile playing at his lips. Thought you might. I'll let the boss know. After Jake departed, Lydia and Yancy walked slowly through the now quiet town. The events of the day had left them both exhausted but oddly energized, as if they'd passed through fire and emerged changed on the other side. Will you really stay? Lydia asked as they reached the Foster's house, where she was still being hosted until the danger was completely past. For a while, Yancy confirmed. Got responsibilities here now. Just responsibilities, her voice held a note of challenge that made his pulse quicken. Yancy stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the moonlight. No, he said honestly. Not just responsibilities. The admission cost him something. The protective shell of isolation he'd built around himself, the belief that caring for someone was a weakness he couldn't afford. Yet as Lydia's face brightened with understanding, he found he didn't regret the loss. Good, she said simply, because I'd like you to come to Sunday dinner at the Fosters, and perhaps escort me to church. And maybe, if you're not too busy with those wild horses of yours, call on me properly sometime. The directness of her invitation startled a laugh from Yancy, a genuine, unguarded sound he barely recognized as his own. Miss Grayson, are you courting me? Someone has to take the initiative, Mr. Owens, she replied with mock primness. And I've observed that you're somewhat slow to recognize opportunities when they present themselves. In that moment, looking down at her upturned face with its mixture of determination, affection, and gentle teasing, Yancy finally acknowledged the truth he'd been fighting since the day he'd first seen her by that overturned stagecoach. He was falling in love with Lydia Grayson, and all his carefully constructed barriers couldn't prevent it. I reckon you're right about that, he admitted. Then, with a courage different from but no less real than what he'd shown in the gunfight, he added, but I recognize this one. The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as Lydia responded with a warmth that banished the last of his hesitation. When they finally drew apart, Yancy rested his forehead against hers, reluctant to break the connection between them. I should go in, Lydia whispered, though she made no move to leave his embrace. Mrs. Foster will be worried. I'll see you tomorrow, Yancy promised, slowly releasing her, and the day after that. And many days after that, I hope, she replied with a smile that seemed to illuminate the night around them. As Yancy watched her enter the Foster home, a sense of possibility settled over him that he hadn't felt in years. The frontier hadn't changed. It was still a harsh, dangerous place that demanded vigilance and strength. But perhaps his understanding of how to survive it had been incomplete. Perhaps true strength lay not in isolation, but in the connections that gave life meaning despite, or even because of, the risks they entailed. With that thought warming him against the autumn chill, Yancy turned toward the hotel, already planning his return to the Triple R to collect his belongings and inform Caleb Reeves that he'd be spending more time in town for the foreseeable future. The following months brought changes to Yancy's life that would have been unimaginable before he met Lydia. He continued his work at the Triple R, but arranged with Caleb to take on duties that kept him closer to Bitter Creek. He found himself spending evenings helping repair the schoolhouse roof, weekends escorting Lydia on rides through the countryside, and Sundays sitting beside her in church, an activity he'd avoided for years. The town, which had once been merely a place to purchase supplies or deliver horses, became familiar territory. Shopkeepers greeted him by name, children ran up to ask about wild animals or tracking skills, and invitations to suppers and socials arrived with increasing frequency. Most surprisingly, Yancy found himself enjoying this new, more connected life. The skills that had made him a solitary figure, his knowledge of horses, his tracking abilities, his frontier competence, now gave him value in the community. When a child went missing in a spring snowstorm, it was Yancy who found her sheltering in a hollow tree. When outlaws threatened the region again, he helped organize a town watch that prevented any repeat of the church siege. Through it all, his relationship with Lydia deepened from tentative courtship to something neither could imagine living without. They complemented each other in unexpected ways, her refinement softening his rough edges, his practicality grounding her idealism. Together they created something neither could have built alone, a bridge between the civilized East and the wild frontier, between book learning and practical wisdom. By the following spring, as the prairie exploded into wildflowers and new life, Yancy knew what he needed to do. He rode to the R one crisp April morning, seeking a private word with Caleb Reeves. "Been expecting this conversation," the rancher said with a knowing smile when Yancy requested time off to travel to Helena. "Got business in the territorial capital, do you?" "Need to visit the land office," Yancy confirmed, "and a jeweler." Caleb clapped him on the shoulder. "About time, son. That young lady's been patient longer than most would have been." 2 weeks later, Yancy returned to Bitter Creek with 2 precious documents: a land deed to a promising parcel 10 miles outside town, and a small velvet box containing a gold ring set with a blue stone that reminded him of Lydia's eyes. He found her at the schoolhouse after classes had ended, grading papers at her desk, with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, gilding her honey-blonde hair. She looked up at his entrance, her face lighting with the smile that never failed to make his heart race. "You're back," she exclaimed, rising to greet him. "I was beginning to worry. Your note only said business in Helena and that you'd return when you could." "Had important things to attend to," Yancy explained, suddenly nervous despite all his planning. "Things that couldn't wait." Lydia studied his face. "You look different, more settled somehow." Yancy took a deep breath, then reached for her hands. "Lydia, when I rode into your life that day by the stagecoach, I thought I was just passing through, doing what needed doing before moving on alone, like always." She squeezed his hands encouragingly but remained silent, sensing the importance of what he was trying to say. "I believed the frontier was no place for attachments," he continued. "That caring for someone just made you vulnerable, made them targets. I was wrong." He met her gaze directly. "You showed me there's another way to live, even out here where life is hard. You showed me that facing dangers together makes us stronger, not weaker." Reaching into his pocket, Yancy withdrew the velvet box and opened it, revealing the ring inside. Lydia's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. "I bought land," he said simply. "Good land with water and timber not far from town, room for horses, for crops, for children someday." "If you want that too," he took another steadying breath. "Lydia Grayson, I love you." "Will you marry me?" For a moment Lydia stood perfectly still, her blue eyes filling with tears that spilled onto her cheeks. Then she was in his arms, saying yes over and over against his chest, her voice muffled by emotion and the fabric of his shirt. When she finally looked up at him, her face radiant with joy, Yancy felt the last remnants of his old life. The solitary, guarded existence he'd maintained for so long fall away completely. In its place stood the promise of something he'd never thought possible on the frontier: a home, a family, a future built with someone who saw both his strength and his scars and loved him for both. "I love you," he said again, marveling at how easily the words came now. "And I promise whatever comes, we'll face it together." "Together," Lydia agreed as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "That's all I've ever wanted." Their wedding took place in June, when the prairie was at its most beautiful. The small church in Bitter Creek overflowed with well-wishers, R cowboys, townsfolk, Lydia's students, and their families. Caleb Reeves stood as Yancy's best man, while Mrs. Foster attended Lydia. As they exchanged vows, Yancy thought of the long journey that had brought him to this moment, not just the physical miles across the frontier, but the emotional distance he'd traveled from isolated survivor to a man embracing connection, community, and love. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Yancy kissed his bride to the cheers of everyone present, he knew with absolute certainty that he had found what all his wandering had been searching for. Not just a place on the map, but a place in the world, with the woman who had taught him that even on the harsh frontier, the human heart needed more than mere survival to truly live. That evening, as they drove a wagon loaded with wedding gifts toward the small cabin Yancy had built on their new land, Lydia leaned against his shoulder, her hand resting on his. "Happy?" he asked, though her radiant expression had already answered the question. "Completely," she confirmed. "Though I was thinking about that day we met, how different things might have been if you decided to ride on instead of helping a stranger in trouble." Yancy considered this, remembering his initial impulse to avoid involvement. "I've wondered that myself," he admitted. "What made you trust me then? You didn't know me from Adam." Lydia smiled, a hint of mischief in her expression. "There was something in your eyes, beneath all that frontier toughness. Something that told me you were a good man, despite your best efforts to hide it." Yancy laughed, pulling her closer as the wagon rolled toward their new home. "Well, Mrs. Owens, I'm mighty glad you saw it." "So am I, Mr. Owens," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder as the setting sun painted the prairie gold around them. "So am I."